Politics is a game of winners and losers. And thus, during an election, there will always be more of a focus on those who have a realistic chance of holding the keys to number 10. Take, for example, Sky's Leaders event taking place in Grimsby Wednesday evening, focusing on Labour and the Conservatives. But away from the big two, something interesting is happening with the smaller parties. Take the Greens launching their manifesto today, building on a fantastic set of local election results. They are now eyeing up multiple seats in Westminster. The Lib Dems have enjoyed a bounce in the polls, perhaps thanks to party leader Ed Davey's love of donning a wetsuit and falling into water. What of reform? Well, they believe that soon they'll overtake the Conservatives in the polls, with a little help from new leader Nigel Farage. And the overall number of candidates standing is up more than 35% on 2019, helped by reform and the Greens, as well as George Galloway's Workers' Party. I'm Niall Paterson, and on this edition of the Sky News Daily, we will be asking, is bigger always better? And what place is there for the smaller parties in a first-past-the-post system? In a moment, we will go through the data. Pollster Scarlett Maguire is back on the pod. But we begin with our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. We today are focusing on that sense of disaffection that I think we picked up on in the YouGov poll yesterday. The way in which the smaller parties do really seem to be coming through in a way in which they weren't, just a few years ago. Is that something that you've detected on the campaign trail?
The YouGov poll was very stark. And if I just sort of pull out a bit, the polling picture is very, in some senses, confusing. And there is no doubt that the polls definitely put Labour on course to win this election and win this election big. But there's a complication, and that's that people don't much like Keir Starmer. Now, they loathe Rishi Sunak. All the polls that I'm looking at show a differential. But here's a question that we asked in the Sky YouGov poll from yesterday. The proportion of people that think that Keir Starmer is going to be a bad PM, Neil, has gone up to 49%. 49%. Even though some of the many of the same people that are going to put him in Downing Street and put him in Downing Street with a healthy majority, he's going to come into power with the British public with their arms folded going, go on, impress me then. And that's the backdrop to today's discussion, because the other thing that the poll told us, and on my way to Grimsby, I stopped off in Ashfield, outside Nottingham, where I picked up in kind of real time what I think that a lot of people seeing an unappetizing choice and going elsewhere. A lot of people were talking about Nigel Farage and his impact. And in a week that's seen the Liberal Democrats kind of jump in the vote and the Greens launching their manifesto today.
Sam, back to you later, but let's dig into the numbers with Scarlett Maguire of Pollster's JL Partners. Scarlett, we've seen some pretty interesting YouGov figures come out yesterday. The Labour Conservative vote, that two-party vote, down to around 56%. You rewind to the 2017 election, the big two took 82%. I'm wondering why that might be.
It's a great question. So 2017 was actually reasonably unusual in just how high a vote share there was in recent history between the two parties, and smaller parties were very, very much squeezed. I think what's interesting about the current state of play is that actually Labour, if the polls are all right, Labour look on course to receive around the same share of the vote that Boris Johnson did in 2019, in sort of low 40%. And I think a lot of what is driving that sort of low overall share, like you just stated, YouGov, is that sort of bottoming out of the Conservative vote. So when you have Conservative vote share in the low 20s, some pollsters even have them slightly under than that, that's going to drive down the share between the two main parties. There's another survey out today that shows the trust in politicians is at record low. And I do think something that we pick up, especially in focus groups, is this disquiet, is this apathy, but it's also just a sense of, well, why should I bother voting because none of them are going to do anything? And I think that environment is an environment in which smaller parties could thrive. Obviously, our system does not lend itself to that, and at which you might see voters starting to turn away from the two main parties.
And one of those parties, of course, is the Greens launching their manifesto today. Pretty bold, in fact, some eye-catching stuff on, taxing the super rich, bumping up national insurance in a way that the two main parties will not do for those over £50,000. But we saw signs of something in a push in the Green fortunes all the way back at the local elections, didn't we?
That was one of the biggest takeaway from the local elections, when the pressure is off in terms of who you're actually putting in number 10. A lot of people feel more able to vote for smaller parties, although actually this election could be recreating that slightly, given that most voters now think that Labour are going to comfortably win. They may feel, again, more able to vote for smaller parties, which is potentially going to prove to be a headache to Labour, just in a couple of seats. But yes, the Green Party, they did very well in the local elections. And this, I think, is something we're seeing, is that we've seen very, very clearly the damage that the Reform Party has done to the Conservative vote from its right, peeling off, we now have it as peeling off 1 in 5 Conservative 2019 voters, which, when you bear in mind they're only keeping 40% of their 2019 voters, to lose that many to the Reform Party is staggering. They are losing about 15% to Labour as well. But for Labour, I think there were some interesting things of what could happen when they start governing and they start trying to hold together what will be an incredibly broad and, in my guess, is quite fractious voting coalition, which will include your young, very sort of left-wing voters and your people who've maybe voted Labour for the first time, even your people who've come back from after voting for Boris Johnson. That is quite a disparate group of people. That's going to be quite hard to hold together. And it may be that you see more and more people peeling off to the left. Now, this is actually something we picked up in our last week of polling. We saw the Greens increase their votes with 18 to 34-year-olds. But I think the local elections is a good example of how interesting the Green Party are, because they're often on sort of 5 or 6% in the polls. They can go slightly unnoticed in terms of, firstly, the sort of major upsets they might cause on election night. I'm thinking of Bristol Central and potentially even in Waveney in sort of Conservative heartlands. But we saw in the local elections that, people vote Greens for lots and lots of different reasons. It might be that they're upset with Labour about its position on the conflicts in the Middle East, which we did see, and we saw some Green candidates harness that upset. It might be they care, like I think with some of these younger voters, they care passionately about climate change, and they think neither of the main parties is taking bold or quick enough action.
Absolutely fascinating, particularly the way in which, and this is entirely anecdotally, Scarlett, I've been speaking to some dyed-in-the-wool true blue Tories who are very, very keen on voting Green this time around. But I suppose the point to be made is, if you step back from all of this, look at the general election, environmental issues don't really seem to be one of the big drums being beaten by the major parties.
So if you take your average voter, the main concerns that dominate are the cost of living, the NHS and immigration. Now, different groups of voters care about different sorts of things. So there's been an awful lot of attention, for quite obvious reasons, over the last few years on your Conservative 2019 voter. They care a lot about immigration as well as NHS and the economy. But if you look at your people who voted Labour in 2019, they care an awful lot more about the environment, about housing. But I think this sense, and something that the Lib Dems have been trying to tap into, and that the Greens will be in part of the country as well. I think some of the environmental concerns, especially over stuff that we saw with the concerns about sewage into waterways, into rivers and seas, it can be important in a different sense, which is that I think all those things tie together into this fundamental concern that voters have, that Britain is not working, that nothing in the country is functioning very well. That's something we hear over and over and over again. That's part of the reason why a lot of voters are so determined to get rid of this government, because they're just saying absolutely nothing is working.
You mentioned the Liberal Democrats there. We have Ed Davey doing those silly stunts which are eye-catching. But then I also remember, Lib Dems winning here as a mantra at by-elections is one which we follow. They do have a good ground game when it comes to elections.
They do, and they've got an advantage compared to, say, something like Reform, who, if you look at polls, are on a higher share of vote than the Liberal Democrats, in that the Liberal Democrat vote is very, very efficient. So not only do they have good ground campaigns, they're quite good at targeting the right seats. So that means that their 10% in the polls could convert to an awful lot more than Reform's 15%. So Liberal Democrats could be looking at anything from sort of 30 to 60 seats, potentially. A massive increase on what they achieved in the last election.
Reform, we've talked around them perhaps too much in this discussion about the smaller parties. And I wonder if it comes down to this. Look, have we not been here before with another party that looked an awful lot like Reform? I've lost count of the number of elections where we have been chasing UKIP up and down the country, and then there was no parliamentary representation on the other side of it. Does Nigel Farage being leader of Reform mean that we have to pay an awful lot more attention to them now? Or is it simply more of the same from those elections in the past that I was talking about?
I think Reform, with or without Nigel Farage, an important force this election. You're right, you have been there with UKIP before for no representation, but UKIP got over 3.5 million votes in 2015 and arguably changed the course of sort of contributed to the most important bit of British policy, a lot of people would say in the last sort of decade has been Brexit. So I think they matter in that way. They are also going to be kingmakers in a lot of seats. Now, not to the parties that they potentially intend to, although Nigel Farage has made it quite clear he does not mind doing damage to the Conservative Party. But if you are a Labour or Liberal Democrat candidate and you are second in what is currently a Conservative-held seat, a very healthy reform share might put in reach a seat that otherwise looked like the majority would be impossible to turn over, even in the sort of bleak conditions that we're currently in for the Conservative Party. So they matter in that sense. I suspect they might get a couple of MPs. If their polling performance holds up, I do think Nigel Farage will win Clacton. They may well pick up one or two more, but Reform and then UKIP before them, as you quite rightly mentioned, are an interesting example of how, even though our first past the post system does not necessarily mean that lots of votes translates into representation in Parliament, they can still have sort of outsized influence.
Well, on that point then, is this shift in British politics towards the smaller parties, such as it is, something that will persist the other side of polling day, or merely a consequence of us being in an electoral cycle? I mean, you mentioned first past the post there. I suppose perhaps for many of these people that we've been talking about, the only way in which that support would persist post July the 4th would be if there were a shift from first past the post to some form of proportional representation.
It's quite difficult to get voters very excited about electoral reform, but something I have heard in focus groups, and especially when, as we've touched on, there is quite a lot of disquiet with the two main political parties, it's a slight sense of frustration that they would like to vote elsewhere, but that vote might not matter. But I suspect the locals this year were a sign of what's to come, in that I would expect the locals next year, the year after, I think we're going to see increasingly strong performance from smaller parties from across the spectrum, but that is just a hunch.
Scarlett, thanks very much for joining us again. Really appreciate your time. Stay where you are. When we return, we will speak again to Sam Coates about the outsider status the smaller parties have been capitalising on. Back soon. Welcome back. With me again, our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Sam, earlier you were talking about the way in which there is a dissatisfaction with the electorate, with the two main parties that are being offered up to them. I wonder if you might go slightly further than that. I wonder if what we are witnessing as people do consider voting for parties that they perhaps wouldn't have even considered voting for in the past, certainly haven't voted for in the past, is that there is a breakdown in trust. That people no longer trust in the political process. They're quite cynical about it. And at times like that, people with outsider status, the Greens, Reform, even the Lib Dems I'd include in that number, become more appealing.
I think that's right. I don't think that it's a completely one-way street. In my lifetime, the fate of the two main parties has gone up and down. It was on and up in 2017, having been on a down for most of my political reporting career. It often can be brought back and rises when there's strong leadership. But I think undoubtedly there is an unhappiness, a discontent, a disaffection, a restlessness amongst our electorate. And that's what I heard on the campaign trail, that there was just something unsatisfactory about Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. And we're in manifesto week, and I think I'd summarise a bit like this. I wonder whether the Tories are, in their manifesto launch, which we saw yesterday, they're just kind of offering too much and people don't quite believe it. And when it comes to Labour, when it comes to specifics, I'm wondering whether they're almost offering too little that people can grasp hold of and believe in. So I think that is a complication in the way that people are seeing this election.
But don't the leaders of the smaller parties have an ability to, speak their mind, make promises that they will never be forced to act upon? I mean, your colleague on your politics podcast, Jack Blanchard, I thought put it quite nicely, talking about Nigel Farage's ability to paint in primary colours, that he can offer net zero migration in a way that neither Rishi Sunak nor Sir Keir Starmer can, because they know that practically it's not possible. Similar with the Greens on their taxing of the super rich. They can say things that frankly, lots of people would love to hear and even see happen, but which are not practical politics.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that works sort of in shadow, in reverse for the Liberal Democrats. I mean, the Liberal Democrats have kind of at this late stage put the NHS at the heart of their manifesto. But really what's been going on with the Lib Dems is they turn themselves under Ed Davey into a simply Conservative Party. So you can either promise too much, as you were saying with the Greens and Nigel Farage, or sort of not really promise anything at all. You become a repository for unhappy voters. They probably do hold the two main parties to a much higher standard. But, he said politics was fair, and this is what they're doing, and politicians are going to have to lump it.
But across the board, this election, it has been all about the people at the top. And I wonder if, given what we're seeing in the polling, that might be a bit of a mistake for the bigger parties, not so much of a mistake for the smaller guys.
You might be right. It's an interesting point, and it's interesting reflecting why this might be. I mean, do you think, Neil, I'm wondering, sort of musing this, in the last 4.5 years, almost other than the ousting of the leader, that the figure of the Prime Minister has been probably supreme in our politics. It was Boris Johnson personally really whose force pushed through Brexit. He personally led quite a lot of the response to COVID and was the face of it for the nation. Liz Truss did what Liz Truss did, taking advice from literally nobody. And Rishi Sunak has run his government a lot like that, big Tory beasts, even like Michael Gove, being pushed a bit to the fringes. So I think a bit of that is a craving for accountability from the guy at the top, because cabinet government has felt like it's mattered less than at any point in my lifetime. And so I wonder whether the campaign reflects the recent past rather than perhaps the way that our structures and systems were set up.
Given what we have seen in the polls, given the emergence of the smaller parties, in something of an eye-raising fashion, do you take Grant Shapps, do you take his comments this morning warning about Labour winning a super majority, do you take that as a concession speech by the Defence Secretary?
No, I take it as a sort of, in desperation, pulling another ripcord to try and come to a soft but still losing landing in this election. At this point, nobody feels that they're going to win, so the goal is to lose less badly. Don't give Keir Starmer a blank cheque is Rishi Sunak's campaign message. Return a few of us. And Grant Shapps' comments really are just a pace with that. It tells you about expectation and what people think about, what the best way of doing that. And then let's see where we end up. By the way, you were mentioning the high Lib Dem figure and the Green figure. We do just have to be a bit careful, because the poll was taken at the point at which the Liberal Democrat manifesto was all over the TV. Really, we need to look in a week or so's time about how these numbers go.
Final question, Sam. If we assume that this is a Labour majority government that is fast approaching, if we assume that the Greens do have parliamentary representation reform, the Liberal Democrats put on a few numbers, I wonder, with a diminished Conservative Party on the opposition benches, how Sir Keir Starmer will play it, where he will find the most difficulty when it comes to those parliamentary occasions when he's dealing with the opposition. Will it be the smaller parties? Will it be the Conservative Party?
It's a great question. Labour's temperament is to ignore everybody else. It's a tribal, not consensual party. And on Monday, Ed Davey said, we might get a Labour-led slide, but, I'm sure Labour will listen to the ideas in my manifesto, particularly around the NHS. And I did sit there thinking, I have met these people before. That won't be option one, because it causes so much internal dissent. And one of the great unknowns is what the Labour Party, the Labour Parliamentary Party, and the Labour Cabinet, if we get there, all look like, and how much difficulty they cause Keir Starmer, probably not at the start, but in years 2 and 3, and what kind of a break they put on them. And at that point, picking up your opponent's ideas, particularly that weren't in your manifesto, and break your promises as the capital gains tax raise that the Lib Dems are proposing to pay for a lot of the health stuff, that would be tricky.
Sam, we will let you get back to what looks like being a very, very busy and long day. Thanks for your time, mate.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.
As I'm often fond of saying, bigger is not always better. Size isn't everything. Good things often come in small packages. For the political parties less well endowed with money and support, elections like this provide opportunities far greater than simply being heard. And whilst the polls show there is little chance of a big upset, they also show some dissatisfaction with Labour and the Conservatives, and a disdain for politics in general. There is a tiny gap in the metaphorical fence surrounding the Commons, and it seems likely the smaller parties might just be squeezing through. That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We'll see you tomorrow.